Good afternoon, everyone. Are you still enjoying your lunch? Yeah, please continue eating, continue finishing up, finish your coffee and desserts as we get started, but we do want to get you out and back to your offices in time, so without further ado, I think we're going to start our program now. First, just a couple of housekeeping matters. If you brought your cell phone, and we can't live without them these days, please just put it on silent if you've forgotten to already. One thing we don't want is to hear your ringtone in the middle of the talk. And our guest is going to speak first for 15, 20 minutes or so, and then we're going to have Q&A. So when we do go around with the microphones, please wait till you get a microphone. I'll probably be the one to kind of point in your direction. Please wait till the microphone comes. Please introduce yourself, and please just keep it short so we can get as many questions in as possible, and just make sure to remember that questions usually end with a question mark. Okay? And one other upcoming event, if you haven't signed up already, on the 24th, which is next Tuesday, we've got Rabbi Abraham Cooper from the Wiesenthal Center coming here to speak at the FCC. I think that's a club lunch, is that correct? That's going to be a really good one. I think there are probably seats left. The topic is Digital Terror and Hate, Implications for Asia and Beyond. So that's Rabbi Abraham Cooper from the Wiesenthal Center. So please sign up for that if you have not already. Now onward for today's event. This has really been a terrible year in Años Horribles for press freedom in Hong Kong and elsewhere around the world. There have been journalists around the world attacked and killed. There have been journalists threatened. There have been journalists just prevented from doing their jobs. And not just here in Hong Kong, but in Asia, in the Philippines, as we know from our friends at Rappler, all over the world, including in the United States, where we have sometimes been labeled as fake news and enemies of the people. Probably the worst moment for journalism has been almost 1 year ago with the murder of Washington Post colleague Jamal Khashoggi. And our guest today, David Ignatius, is the perfect person to talk about all of these events. He's written a series of columns that won various prizes, but have won this year's a prize for uncovering the Saudi complicity in American quiet in the face of the Khashoggi murder. He'll talk about that and all kinds of other things today. David Ignatius, after finishing and studying economics at Cambridge, fortunately for the world of journalism, decided to become a journalist and went into the Wall Street Journal, where he held a variety of jobs, starting out covering the steel workers, going on to cover the Justice Department, the CIA, being the diplomatic reporter, and covering the Middle East. And then fortunately for the Washington Post, he moved on to the Washington Post in the mid-1980s, where he started out as the Outlook editor. He was the assistant managing editor for Business News. He was the foreign editor, and he was for 3 years the executive editor of the International Herald Tribune. Since 1998, he's written the global affairs column for the Washington Post. And I can say on a personal note that he was one of the best editors and best colleagues I've had when he was the foreign editor at the Washington Post. And that's not just because he put my stories on the front page. It's also because when he was business assistant managing editor, he had the smarts to hire Jody Schneider at the Washington Post. Unfortunately, she didn't stay at the Washington Post. She moved on to bigger and better things after 5 years. If you don't think David has a distinguished resume and CV already, and if you want to make yourself really jealous, just think he's also published 10 spy novels, one of which was made into a movie directed by Ridley Scott and starring Leonardo DiCaprio and Russell Crowe. We just downloaded it and watched it a couple of days ago, so I highly recommend it to all of you. And the next spy novel, the latest spy novel, The Quantum Spy, deals with China, so maybe we'll even hear a bit about that. So without further introduction, David Ignatius.
So it's really a pleasure to be here at the fabled Foreign Correspondents Club, especially with my hosts, starting with Keith. The Washington Post, when we refer to Keith Richburg, it usually begins with the legendary Keith Richburg. Keith was a foreign correspondent for us when I was foreign editor. If we had a really difficult story and somebody who would get there quickly and bravely and just get the job done, the answer was usually Keith. As people may know, the first Western reporter in Kabul after the Americans came in in, what was it, September, October?
November 2001.
November 2001 was Keith. And Keith and I were talking about this the other day. And Keith was describing how he got to, they said, where are you going? And he thinks, gee, there must be an Intercontinental Hotel. So he says, take me to the Intercontinental Hotel. They haven't seen a visitor, in probably years, and they ask Keith if he has a reservation. He has breakfast, relaxes, takes a shower, and then, I won't name him, but a very prominent British television journalist arrived some hours later to announce that he was the first Western correspondent in Kabul, which amuses Keith to this day. It is true that I hired Jody Schneider, who's a wonderful editor. I'm delighted that she has gone on to do such good work for Bloomberg. It's also a fact that I used to do business with Eric Wistar. When I was editor to the National Herald Tribune, we were desperately poor, and I used to go hat in hand to AFP and plead with Eric to let us have the AFP wire and not raise prices for us, and usually was successful. Before I start, I also want to note in the audience, when I walked into the club Thursday night, I guess it was, I saw Robin Moyer. And Robin Moyer is one of those people in our business you never forget. Robin and I were a day late for the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. Somehow we just didn't get there in time so we landed in Damascus, desperate to get to Beirut, and we found a crazy Syrian taxi driver who agreed to take us all the way to Beirut. All the way to Beirut, you sure? Yeah. So, of course, the Israelis were bombing and shelling everything in sight, and he decided halfway to Beirut that he had other things to do and dumped me and Robin. Robin remembered the name of the town, Shtura, and so we somehow found a Lebanese taxi driver who would take us from Shtura to Beirut, and had one of the great, it was like a story on the hoof. The Israelis had already gotten so far north in Lebanon, they were bracketing the highway that we were driving on, which was pretty wild, and then we kind of finally get to the Corniche going up the coast to Beirut, if you remember that drive, and, anti-aircraft are going off, the Palestinians trying to shoot down Israeli planes. It was pretty exciting. Sure made a heck of a good story. And I hadn't seen Robin. We spent, that goofy summer. One of the things we found to do, because there wasn't much to do in a city under siege, Robin and I played squash in a court that had been built by, I think, the Saudi ambassador. And so that's how we kept going in that summer of 1982. So it's great to see all these friends and to be here. I want to talk to my fellow enemies of the people about the threats that we face. I'm going to talk about three different aspects of this, but I want to begin, as Keith suggested, by talking about my colleague and friend Jamal Khashoggi, who was murdered. It will be 1 year on October 2nd. We're going to do a lot of things at the Post to commemorate this, but I just note that it's been a year since this happened. And I want to start by just telling you a little bit about who he was. I was lucky enough to actually have known him. I first met him in 2003, so I'd known him for about 15 years when he was killed. And he was somebody I thought of as a friend. It's a strange experience when you have a friend who is assassinated and dismembered. For a number of us at the Post, that was a motivation to take this especially seriously. But I've felt that one thing that he would want is for people to be honest about who he was. He was a complicated person. If you've read that in his youth he was a friend of Osama bin Laden, that's true, he was. He had very extreme views as a young man. He had a passion for purifying the Arab world and his own country of corruption, as he saw it, the legacy of colonialism. One thing that's fascinating about the arc of his career is that over time he decided I'm convinced that the way in which the Arab world would be purified of this deep corruption was journalism. He came to think that it wasn't the Muslim Brotherhood, it wasn't Islam that was going to be the fire that burned away all the evils, but it was journalism, the light of the truth. And I think that is the right rebuttal to all of the things you may have read trying to undercut him and question whether he was a serious journalist. The Saudis have done quite a lot of media work trying to say that he was really a Muslim brother the whole time, and I have personal reason to reject that. Another thing I want to say about him to a group of journalists is that he had that lovable thing that's hard to explain that made him a troublemaker. He just, for owners of publications, he was a pain in the neck because he when he was supposed to, kind of get it done and not run this story, please, he ignored them. He was hired by his friend Prince Turki, was really his lifelong friend until the last couple of years, a key member of the royal family, son of King Faisal, to run their family newspaper called Al Watan. And he lasted in that first job in 2003 for 2 months. And he published something about the religious establishment in Saudi Arabia and how wooden and uncooperative it was. They chucked him. He went out in the wilderness. Prince Turki became ambassador to London. He went with Prince Turki to London, helped him there. Went with Prince Turki to Washington, where he was Washington ambassador. I mean, this is a guy who was, for a journalist, pretty close to power for all these years. But so he gets hired by Al Watan again as editor in 2007. This time he lasts 3 years, and again, there's a story about the Salafist conservatism and reactionary character of the Saudi religious establishment that he publishes in the paper. Gets fired. He has yet another chance to be a journalistic big shot. Prince Al-Walid bin Talal, who I'm sure people who follow Saudi Arabia know about, multi-billionaire, worth somewhat fewer billions since he spent some time in the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. But he was interested in starting a satellite TV channel in Bahrain, hired Jamal to run it for him. In that case, the channel was on the air for less than 24 hours because Jamal, as a journalist, thought, what's the point of having a satellite channel based in Bahrain if you don't talk to the Bahraini political opposition, which was Shiite and the blood enemy of the ruling Sunni monarchy. So that was Jamal. He was a person who just kept doing it. When he came to Washington to work with us in 2017, he knew from pretty early on that he was a marked man, that he was in trouble. When I say a marked man, he didn't know that he was going to be assassinated, but he knew that it was dangerous. He had started off when Prince Salman became king in 2015. His son Mohammed became crown prince. Early on, he thought there were some positive things. He wrote, contrary to some other Saudi reformers, fairly sympathetically about MBS's reforms. He changed his mind about that. In the final months of his life, he told mutual friends that he wished he could just run away to a desert island. He kind of saw the clouds developing and then finished his own sentence and knew that he couldn't. He had become by then so famous, so prominent as that rare Saudi who was willing to speak out that he knew he just couldn't pull back. So that's who he was. I think it does him, as I said earlier, a disservice to treat him as a one-dimensional martyr. He was a complicated person, had a complicated personal life, but he had this, holy journalistic quality of being prepared at the key moment to be a troublemaker. So who killed him? The CIA, in its testimony to Congress, and certainly all the reporting that I have done, says he was killed on orders of the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman. This is something that President Trump to this day won't acknowledge. I think it's a real black mark on him. I'll just preview for all of you the reporting I hope to publish. I don't know whether this is on the record. I'll try to assume it is. So in the reporting that I've done, I've tried to understand how this progressed. So by the summer of 2018, I've written, there are communications from the royal court that said, bring him back. We need to deal with this problem. There was a man who was working for Mohammed bin Salman running what was known by the anodyne, harmless term, the Center for Studies and Media Affairs. Try getting more elusive than that. The head of the Center for Studies and Media Affairs was one Saud al-Qahtani, very interesting character who had done black media operations for the previous king, King Abdullah. Under King Abdullah, he had gone to the leading hacking firm of the day, an Italian company called Hacking Team. And if you want to go online, you can see his messages to this Italian company seeking the latest in their surveillance technology, things that would help you, sort of early versions of technology that would get inside your cell phone, turn your cell phone into an antenna, a camera, etc. So even before King Salman arrived, he was in this kind of work. Initially, he was mistrusted for that reason by MBS, who wondered was he a potential traitor. So I think one reason he wanted to prove that he was, absolutely ready to do whatever it took. So in the prelude to the operation on October 2nd, a lot of things happened. Saud al-Qahtani increasingly began to treat social media space much the way the Russians do, as a domain of war. He saw Arabic Twitter is among the most intense in the world. And he began to develop what he called the blacklist. Anybody who was critical of MBS or the regime would get listed and would be treated as an enemy and ostracized, attacked. There were other examples that I've written about of renditions, people who were snatched overseas and brought back to the kingdom. There were people in the kingdom who were grabbed and put in prison, some of whom still remain. So it wasn't as if this was an isolated, one-shot incident. I think it's really important for us. We're so focused on our colleague. It's really important to remember that this affected Saudis from every walk of life who were willing to be critical. The information that I have is that after Jamal went to the consulate in Istanbul wanting to get papers to marry a Turkish girl that he'd met and fallen in love with, and the Saudis knew he was coming back for a specific rendezvous to finish the paperwork, word went out from the intelligence officer who was stationed in the consulate, he's coming back, and the plot that led to Jamal's death began. It's my sense that initially that plot, as ordered by one of the intelligence agency officers, the deputy head of intelligence, was a rendition order. I think that was superseded by something coming from the royal court, probably from this man, Saud al-Qahtani, that went further. I'm not sure the U.S. has the specific language that was used in that order, but I believe that the team that was sent changed at that point and added to the team was this doctor who had the bone saw or whatever it was that was used to dismember Khashoggi. Khashoggi goes to the consulate door on October 2nd, enters. We now know about the conversation that was taking place in the minutes before he arrived. If you read carefully the report that was done by Agnes Kalamar, the UN Special Rapporteur, you'll see that she has transcribed the surveillance tape that the Turks ran from before Jamal gets there. And the head of the team, a man named Maher Mutreb, and this doctor, Salah Tubegi, are discussing, it appears from the tape, dismembering Jamal. It's a discussion about either the possibility or the prospect that he would be murdered. So there is this element of premeditation and cold-bloodedness to this that I'm going to try to look at more carefully than I have with more evidence in a couple of weeks on the anniversary. Let me close my comments about Jamal by asking a question that people sometimes ask me, and it's a good one. Journalists get killed or arrested almost every day. I mean, it's unfortunately a fact of life. I'll go through some numbers in a minute, but why this one? What was it about the death of Jamal Khashoggi that a year later we're still talking about it? Members of Congress have mobilized to protest it. It's a global phenomenon. It's a symbol of the threats more generally to the press. And I'll give you just my basic explanation. The first reason is one I'm really proud of. It's because he worked for the Washington Post. And we didn't let this go. We took it seriously. Individuals like me who'd known him, I just basically put everything else I had to do aside and worked on this for months. Our publisher, working for Jeff Bezos, the richest man in the world, all sorts of business interests. Our publisher just was absolutely unyielding in his demands, advertisements the paper would run. Our owner, Jeff Bezos, was forthright. We'll see, but it cost him certainly business in Saudi Arabia. The Saudis, I think, made it impossible to order from Amazon. So it was first the fact that he was from the Washington Post. Second, it was the fact that it was the most inept, transparently absurd cover-up. I mean, the initial story the Saudis put out made Nixon's Watergate cover-up, look brilliant. It just collapsed of its own weight, and I think that was it. It made them look so manipulative. And then finally, let's be honest. It was the brutality, not simply of the killing, but of the dismemberment. If there's one phrase that comes to mind when people talk about Khashoggi, it's bone saw. I mean, that makes this different, makes it something unforgettable. I do want to just stress that this is a world of attacks on our colleagues. It's one thing that worries me about all the focus on Jamal. I mean, Turkey gets a free ride. Turkey's been exposing all the details and, been a great source for journalists who want to cover this. And so people don't write so much about how many Turkish journalists are in jail. I mean, Turkey had some of the great newspapers in the, what we used to call the third world, Cumhuriyet, Hurriyet. I mean, fabulous journalists, people who were colleagues and friends of mine. They were all fired, silenced in one way or another. There's a Stockholm press center that counts 165 journalists who've been arrested there as of last December. Egypt. Egypt's a place I still go a lot. I lectured to a group of journalism students at the American University in Cairo a couple months ago. And I tried to figure out what you say to these kids as a journalist to encourage them to do good work, to be members of this fraternity that we're all part of, without getting them killed. I mean, I don't want young people to take risks that they're going to be in prison or killed. So it was a really interesting conversation about how you push the limits, how you try to tell the truth, but still stay alive. There are 32 journalists who are in prison in Egypt right now. Syria, you don't even want to talk about how many journalists have gotten killed there. Westerners like Marie Colvin and others. It's just been a terrible killing field. Russia, 58 journalists have been killed. 58 have been killed in Russia since 1992, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists. So it's a dangerous place out there. I look at my Hong Kong colleagues who just were out in such numbers. Since Keith had been kind enough to pay my way, I thought it'd be crazy not to get a gas mask and go out and kind of see the local story. There's so many journalists who were out there yesterday evening, taking the risk to tell the story, to do it right. I think, the challenge that you all face with a story that's so emotional and lovable is to keep enough distance to report on it objectively. I think that's that'll be the hardest part of this. When your heart is kind of with a movement, you have to pull yourselves back. So I'm going to close with just one more comment about threats to our business, and then open up to questions from all of you. Keith and I have been talking a lot about this, but we really are examples of people who were trained in the values of what's now, at least in the U.S., sort of laughingly described as the mainstream media. I mean, you get a snigger when you say, I'm with the mainstream media. And there's this idea, of balance, on the one hand, on the other hand, you guys. There are a lot of younger journalists who think that's so old-fashioned and who are engaged as journalists, who see their job as campaigning more. And I understand that, and there's some great stories that we've all written that we feel made a difference because they had that edge. But I really am worried. In the U.S., polls show that people are really sick of Donald Trump. There is this fatigue. His approval numbers are low. They just don't budge. But unfortunately, they're even sicker of politics and the people who write about politics, because they just feel that it's everything comes at them with spin. That every story is written by somebody who basically started with an idea of who the good guys and who the bad guys were. If you look at cable news in the States, most places, you see that cable news networks basically are in the job now of making you feel that the way you look at the world is right. That the people you think are good guys are really good, and the people you hate are really even worse than you thought. And that's what they do. Unfortunately, that is not restricted to the right, to Donald Trump supporters. It's increasingly. So I just feel as if this is a time when people, even at the risk of being old-fashioned and mainstream media fuddy-duddies, need to hold on tight to the idea, not that we can be objective, obviously that's impossible, but that we can be fair and listen to both sides and give people a chance to make up their own minds. And I worry that if we don't, we're just going to be swept away. People increasingly will not trust information, and there'll be growing reasons as information is manipulated by governments why they shouldn't trust it. And if we're seen as in some way part of that, I just don't know what. There'll still be a Foreign Correspondents Club. Certainly, there'll still be a bar downstairs. Can't imagine that. Hong Kong will continue to exist without that FCC bar, but I worry that the business that we came into and love will be increasingly fragile. So I want to stop there. I'd love to take some questions if people have any. Keith, I'll just stay up here. Do you want to recognize people?
Yeah, please stay up there. We'll recognize you. Thank you very much for that talk and for that reminder about the importance of press freedom. It reminds me to let you all know that we're going to be doing a silent march on Wednesday at 6 p.m. just outside. Protest. That's standing there silently protesting outside the FCC at 6 p.m. on Wednesday for press freedom. We're going to take questions now, and please, I just want to remind you that we are photographing and we are videotaping this, so if you don't want to be a TV star on Facebook and YouTube, you might want to put on a mask or something, but otherwise, we'll put your hands up. And I'll just start with the first question, David, if I may, while the microphones are going around. Could you talk about social media? You mentioned cable TV, but so many people get their news now through Twitter and Facebook, et cetera. How is that contributing to this polarization, et cetera?
Well, I think social media, the flatness of the media world, the ability to select the media that, in a sense, you agree with, that reinforces the way you look at the world, while it has some wonderful congenial aspects, my face group buddies, my little social media community, it shares this problem that I was describing earlier, that it reinforces the polarization. People who studied this carefully say that the divisions in American society, increasingly in European society, are built into the algorithms that drive social media and other websites. YouTube, you like a video on YouTube, and YouTube will dish you up another one that's like it, but is a little, more oomph. And then it'll take you, it pushes you, not by conspiracy, but because this is what's best for the advertisers that are buying that space, toward ever more extreme content that's stickier. You like it, you get more like it. So I think people need to think a lot more about social media, about the way they're sort of reinforcing feedback loops that they get caught in without beginning to realize it. A lot of people, I don't know about in this room, increasingly just are turning off social media. The number of people who say, "That's it. I'm leaving Twitter. I can't take the crazy, shrill debates about everything. I don't want to look at it anymore." That's too bad, because Twitter's a spectacular source of information. But if it's just a kind of echo chamber, if it's just a confirmation bias enhancer, then people should leave it.
Okay, questions? We've got a microphone here.
Yes.
Let's see. Okay. Please identify yourself first.
Hi, thank you. This is Brian Taylor, Recycling Today Media Group, and thank you, David, for your comments. My question is about something that seems pretty prevalent in this part of the world, self-censorship. And the fact, I guess, that you've been around 30 plus years, how have you seen self-censorship maybe manifest itself? And is it something that only happens in authoritarian government districts, regions, or do you see it happening in the West as well? Thanks.
So opinions that will get you in trouble, people tend not to express, and that's true if you're in China. But it's unfortunately true if you're on a college campus. It's true if you work for the New York Times. I mean, there is a process of shaming of people who hold opinions other people don't like that is worrisome. It happens on the right, it happens on the left, it happens in places like China, it happens, it's just a phenomenon of the world we're living in. And I think people in our business who are all about openness and being able to say whatever the heck you think ought to speak out a little bit more about this than we do, about the self-censorship that takes place. And we're now in a period where people things that people have done, in particular in personal sexual relations, are being exposed, and those people are being attacked, and that's in most cases appropriate. You can imagine being in a period where it became difficult for people to have conversations about some of these topics, and I don't want to live in a world where you can't talk about something.
Philip Bauer.
Philip Bowering, columnist. First of all, David, I'd like to thank you for your role at the International Herald Tribune. The decline of that paper started with your departure in 2002, when the New York Times took over, since when the world has lost a great title. My question is this. The US has a long and perfectly reasonable history of supporting all kinds of dictatorial regimes which have killed journalists. Marcos was one, and now we have Saudi Arabia as being another. Where do we try to draw the line in foreign policy terms between supporting people who support serious suppression of the press and other foreign policy goals? Is it possible to draw lines?
Just to first thank Philip for the writing and analysis he did for the IHT before my time, during my time, and after. Phil had a wonderful knack for making powerful people angry. Unfortunately, sometimes those powerful people would then issue libel writs. But Philip was great at withstanding that also. So why do we support all these intolerant press wrecking autocrats? Under Donald Trump, the answer seems to be they're birds of a feather. I mean, Donald Trump attacks the media as enemies of the people, and there's not much space, it would seem, between how he looks at the media and how the leaders of some of these autocracies look at the media. But this is a problem that obviously, it existed under Barack Obama. Barack Obama supported a pretty repressive Saudi Arabia. And I think it's something to... The simple answer is that journalists should be in solidarity with other journalists and with the expression of opinion no matter where it happens. And there just isn't a foreign policy reason that should justify the suppression of press freedom in Turkey or Egypt. Go down the list. And again, I want to brag on the Washington Post. If there's one thing that really distinguishes, especially our editorial page and my colleagues Fred Hyatt and Jackson Deal, it's that they do not let a week pass without writing about journalists, human rights activists who are under threat in countries that are nominally friends of the United States. And I think that's just one of the best things about the paper. And it's the simple answer to Phil's question. I mean, hopefully over time we'll have governments in Washington that do a better job of protecting, caring about human rights. But until then, that doesn't mean that there's nothing that we can do, because there is as journalists. So we can write about it. We can remember the people who were forgotten. We can go through the list of names who were in prison. And when we go see somebody, we can ask a question about that'll make that person squirm about somebody that he has put in jail.
Questions over here in the corner?
Jin Chen for Forbes Asia. For young journalists working in places where reporting the truth might increasingly involve risking your lives, so what's your advice for them? For journalists on the mainland China and increasingly here in Hong Kong.
So I'll give the advice that I would give as foreign editor to our own journalists, the Washington Post. We want you to cover the story aggressively. We do not want you to take risks that could lead to your death or serious injury. People are brave, and they sometimes want to do things that put them, in extreme jeopardy. And one of the hardest parts of my job was to say no to that courageous. I remember we had a woman journalist who wanted to do something that was incredibly important, but just the chances that she would survive it seemed to me to be, just unacceptably low. So I told her she couldn't, and I hated doing that. We have journalists who wanted to freelance for us, in places like Syria, and we said, oh, okay, we'll take an article if you send it to us. One of those people was Austin Tice, who has been in prison in Syria for at least 6 years. We don't know if he's dead or alive. But we now understand that in the moment where we say, oh, okay, well, send us a piece, we incur a moral responsibility. So we're much less likely to say that today. We'll say no to that brave, wonderful young person who says, I want to do it, I want to take the risk. We'll say no, because we just don't want to be in the position of something terrible happening, and we, in effect, encouraged it. So, I admire every one of the reporters who I saw yesterday afternoon, in a dicey situation with tear gas and other things, and who knew what was going to come landing on them, who were taking the risks, and that those seem like acceptable risks. There are others that are more extreme that I think a good editor would say no. I mean, and that's, in the end, I'll just finish the answer. This is a job for editors. Reporters want to report. I mean, and they're going to want to do it. And I think what editors earn their pay, Eric's done this. I mean, you earn your money when you say to that wonderful young person, no, you can't do it. It's because there's too much danger that you'll get hurt.
Good question so far. Mark?
Mark Berger. I know that commercial companies like Ogilvy have started a behavioral studies department to analyze implicit and confirmation bias. And they fold this into the work that they do for marketing purposes. Has there anything been done at the Washington Post or the New York Times or other mainstream media where they're doing something officially or formally with their staff to get them to understand confirmation bias and implicit bias?
Not to my knowledge, and that's a wonderful thought. So Chris Graves, who you may know and who did this research for Ogilvy, is one of my heroes, and I have shamelessly used some of his research. Chris was based in Hong Kong for a long time, and in Shanghai maybe also. But Chris has written why arguing the facts doesn't work anymore. And it has to do with this phenomenon that social science researchers have figured out a long time ago, that people filter facts, filter information coming at them, and they filter out the facts that challenge their bias, and they embrace the facts that confirm it. It's just, it's part of how people are. And another thing that Chris has found is basically the louder you argue, the more you say to the Trump supporter, I can't believe you're so stupid, why do you back this person? Rather than having an effect of convincing that person to re-examine the facts, which you want them to do, they pulled much tighter into their. So the implication, which is the part I hadn't thought about, is what does that mean for newspapers? I mean, the Washington Post every day is looking at some crazy thing that Donald Trump did and looking at why the real thing in whatever nominal event is this screwball action by the president. So it's like daily drumbeat of it's part of what's exhausting for people. It's all the Washington Post or other newspapers sometimes seem to write about from Washington. At least that's what people. So do we need to think about a way to moderate that? Do we need to think about how we're playing into these psychological realities of confirmation bias and filtering? It's a fascinating question. I don't think it's been raised, but when I go home, it gives me something to do.
Okay, we've got time for one last question, and if I don't see a hand up, I'm going to ask it. Okay. There's no hand up.
Sorry, Keith. No, just looking forward to the election next year. I saw there's a bit of a hit list on the Trump side of journalists that they're going to discredit if they see them having an anti-Trump bias. So, I mean, the environment already in American media is pretty hostile in the Trump era. How do you see it developing or degenerating in the coming year or so?
We'll see. Believe me, you would not want to look at my Twitter feed or. I'm pretty high on some people's lists. I think the thing that I'd say about the election more generally, I don't know if Trump is reelected, the consequences for the United States are so severe potentially. Journalism is a subset of that matters especially to people in this room, but it's the larger consequences of 4 more years of his presidency that I think people should think about. I think this election, one way to think about it is as a character test for the American people. All the evidence, even given the problems of confirmation bias and what we talked about, all the evidence is there for a rational person to make up his or her mind. It's not like you need more, there's a lot of, disinformation around, a lot of spin, but it's transparent. People can look at this president and the people around him, and democracy in theory is the ultimate self-correcting system. If it isn't going right, you vote him out. I think it really comes down to how voters sift this information and whether they exercise their responsibility as citizens in a mature way. And if they do, I think things are going to work out fine. It takes us into a whole other conversation about what's behind the Trump vote and what's really going on. I'll close by saying, one of the things that's most painful for me when I travel around the world is people will say, I never imagined that America was a country that could elect Donald Trump as president. You often hear that. And you can say, well, we tend to revert to the mean, and this won't last forever, and all the things that you say. But what people's takeaway is, if this could happen once, then America itself is a different place than I thought it was. And I think that's why this is a character test. I think people in the United States need to look pretty deep at what's going wrong. There's a rage at inequality that's just palpable. And if it isn't addressed, we are going to blow. We're on the way. So I'll close it there. It's not all that cheery a note, but it's what a treat to be at the Foreign Correspondents Club, to kind of be walking in the footsteps of the great and legendary. Do make good use of your bar. I hope you do better at getting Albert's attention. Is that his name? Than I did. I kept trying to get another drink, and Albert just didn't know who I was, because I'm not a member of the FCC. So thank you very much.
Thank you, David. And wait, before you go, everyone who comes to the FCC goes away with a gift.
Thank you.